Hello, my name is Ben Davis, and I am here to talk to you about a community archiving workshop series that I'm conducting in conjunction with Dr. Roberts and the Texas Freedom Colonies Project. I run a company called Brazos Archival, and we focus on digitizing, providing access, and preserving archival materials for small museums and personal archives. This will be a three-part workshop series covering arrangement and description, preservation, and digital archives. And so, according to the Society of American Archivists, community archives are defined as the documentation of a group of people that share common interests and social, cultural, and historical heritage, usually created by members of the group, being documented and maintained outside of traditional archives. So, when communities are able to advocate for themselves, then we may actually be contributing to a more accurate and inclusive history. And so the goal of these workshops are to empower you to document yourself. So workshop number one will address arrangement and description. And you can think of arrangement as the organization and sequencing of physical items, and description you can think of as creating a set of data to describe those physical items. So the act of archiving is as much about being talented at or being good at getting rid of things as determining what to save. So with regard to that, the Society of American Archivists defines archives as records created or received by a person, family, or organization and preserved because of their continuing value. So continuing value is what we want to focus on in this stage, and defining continuing value. So on the left, you'll see some criteria for defining continuing value. Those criteria are financial, can be legal, sentimental, evidential, and if you're an organization, you might want to define organizational policies. Typically, financial criteria are not high on the agenda of an archive, as it doesn't provide a lot of meaning, but you may very well come across financially valuable objects in your archive, jewelry or rare books, for instance. Legal criteria for value are important. Hopefully that's high on your priority list. That could include birth certificates, passports, information with social security numbers, articles of establishment for a business. Sentimental value can also be important. You may come across a wooden cooking spoon that reminds you of times you spent in the kitchen cooking with your grandmother, or an old wrench even that you used to help your grandfather fix things in the garage. It's difficult to say what will have meaning in that way, but those objects can be embedded with those memories, so you'll want to keep them. And they may have stories attached to them as well. Value can also be evidential, like proof that an event happened, for instance, with letters, maybe letters written by a relative from overseas during a war. You may come across a bill of sale for an object or even a property, and this you may also come across receipts that would document the evidence of success of a business. If you are an organization, it's probably a good idea to define organizational policies with regard to collecting and defining that value. So, for instance, you may want to define your collection based on regional boundaries or a cultural movement. You want to define your space and let others specialize in their areas. Don't try not to overlap with other organizations collecting in other areas. And if you're migrating to an institution and from your personal archive, like you're donating to an archive, it's important that you know what policies those organizations collect around. And as you're defining continuing value, you want to document your process. So, for instance, you never know what's going to be sentimental to other people. And down the road, you may have a relative that may come to you and say, "Why did you get rid of this thing?" And you'll be able to kind of explain that and account for your process if you document that. Um, also, if you are an organization, you'll want to define parameters for care to make sure that it's clear what level of care you're able to provide. You may have only enough resources to provide a certain level of care. And also, if you're donating your personal archive to an organization, it's helpful to understand what the limits of that care are. Um, and for instance, that can take the form of digital access and whether or not that will be made available and who gets to keep original artifacts. And so, to save or not to save, that is the question. So, typically, items worth saving kind of fall into the criteria on the left here. So, if something tells a story, that's really important. That's the rich fabric that fills in the broader level research of county level records like census, tax roll, probate, court minutes, deed records. So the stories that fill in those narratives and help provide a human history and a personal history to that research is so important. So anything like letters or anything documenting a personal history. Also, you may come across things that are visually interesting, photographs that may remind you of a place or document a place, or annotations in books can be interesting. Also, rare or unusual artifacts. If you come across a group of items with a lot of items in them, you'll want to pick out the outliers and the really important pieces. Like, for instance, one journal entry out of many may document an important event, but the rest of the journal entries are just about going to the grocery store that day. For instance, I inherited a massive set of teacups with flowers painted on them because my great grandmother was an art teacher in Jasper, Texas, and for decades she painted flowers on teacups, and now I have to decide what to do with them, and I'm just going to keep the best ones probably. As we talked about, some things are evidentiary, and you may be able to prove the success of a business with evidentiary records. And legal and financial obligation, you may have tax records that are still within the time limit that you need to keep. With regard to quality of condition, some things just may be too far gone to keep, and we'll talk more about that later, but it's important to make that call because damaged materials can affect other things around them, like with mold or deterioration. So items that you don't want to keep, if you're looking at photographs that you don't know anybody in the photographs and you don't understand what they were made for, you may not need to hang on to that. Receipts are kind of a typical thing you don't want to hang on to. It's just not providing any context. Also, if the value is just not evident there, like if you come across an old sock in a drawer, that's probably not going to retain any value. If an item is in poor condition because of mold, it's a really serious issue because mold can transfer to other items. And if you come across duplicates, just pick one or two and hang on to those, but you don't need to keep everything. Like, for instance, if you come across neat letterhead or something, you may keep one or two of those. And if you know something is just not going to be used, you don't know why the owner kept it, then you can probably move on from that. So here's a receipt from an evidentiary receipt from Lee Harvey Oswald. If you come across one of those in your drawer, you probably want to hang on to that. But your personal receipts from going to the grocery store that are stuck in your junk drawer, that's probably not worth saving. So lasting impacts, can actually be unethical to exclude things from an archive. We all have family members who may have a conflicted or controversial history, but it's important that we document everything, and there are ways to approach that are ethical. If you have a family member that's still living and they could be embarrassed by this, then you may delay access and state that in the agreement between you and the institution you're donating to. You could use a pseudonym for that person. And with regard to privacy, anything with personal credentials probably doesn't need to be kept. Resumes, anything that provides height or weight information or social security numbers, student information, and legal considerations. If you're reporting to a legal body, it's important to know what record types you need to hang on to, for instance, an estate or tax records or anything like that, if there's a lawsuit pending. And it's also important to know the time that you need to keep those, or if there is a statute of limitations for that. Physical materials, no matter what, everything begins with a pile of unorganized, chaotic mess, and mess is a part of this process. It's very normal, so you just kind of embrace it. But the very first step in the entire process is designating a space or a staging area, and I like to designate a second area as well if you have the space, is an output area. So you have an area that you're working on, that you're organizing things in initially, and then once you've categorized and organized and digitized things, you have another area for that, so you know those items are finished. And even within that, if you're working with lots of people, for instance, it can be helpful to designate piles devoted to particular people, like a volunteer, so you don't overlap on somebody's work. Initially, though, you want to start broad and then refine. Don't try to get too detailed. You will get decision fatigue, and that will set in. And it's best just to be intuitive about the initial process. So make piles, broad categories, and use temporary labels, like even a sheet of notebook paper on the floor. And it's important that this is all temporary at this stage, because you're going to have to move that. And just be intuitive about it. There's a concept in archiving known as MPLP, which is more product, less process. So, being really nitpicky and detailed about things leaves lots of stuff inaccessible that nobody gets to see. So groups, batches, piles, and clusters. You want to group like material types, and perhaps by owner or subject, like Uncle Henry's photos and Aunt Gertrude's photos might be separate piles. And those piles may be according to provenance, like who the owner or maker of those objects were. And original order, if one can be discerned, you want to keep that. But if, for instance, you get something in a big trash bag and you have to dump it out anyway just to see it, you can probably assume there was no original order there, and you will need to make up your own order. So one really famous example of that was Francis Bacon's art studio, which was cataloged and archived and moved exactly as it was to a gallery in Ireland. And this was because he considered it his idea machine and crucial for generating ideas. So with regard to providing access, you'll need to start with an inventory of these piles that you just created. And spreadsheets are preferable because they're the first building block in a database. And a Word file is fine if that's what you're comfortable with, but ultimately it's going to need to get transferred to a spreadsheet eventually. And a spreadsheet will allow you to sort and filter information, and it's just conducive to this process. Typically the way that spreadsheets work when you're setting one up is rows are records and columns are fields. And if you need a template for that, don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'm happy to email you a template with fields already built into them. And so you also want to define who's going to use your collection. Is digitization going to be an option? And should the original materials be made available? And also, who is going to be the audience? Do you even want to make these items public? And you want to work that out in the agreement. Also, you want to create a guide to how the collection should be used. If you can label photos or provide any context possible, it's really important. This may be your last chance to let the world know what they're looking at.